Man, it has been a while since I've reviewed one of these. Gotta say, I kinda missed it. The last time I did something like this was when I reviewed Final Fantasy VI, which was no doubt an absolute masterpiece of a title, and a perfect example of taking the 2D SNES era of Square to its highest point, only matched by Chrono Trigger, a game I have not actually played yet. But with those games handled, a new dimension of gaming was on the horizon, and with it came Square's most popular title probably of all time, Final Fantasy VII. Now, unlike other multiple Final Fantasy games that I've reviewed on here, 7 was a game I actually knew the story of inside and out despite not actually playing it. Kind of hard not to when literally everyone never stops talking about it. Well, I say talk about it, but it was more just argue over if Cloud was fucking Tifa or Aerith, since that's all those people talk about nowadays, when in reality it was probably just Red 13 or something, I don't know. But even with those people kind of stinking up the fan base, I'll admit, it didn't dampen my excitement in the slightest of finally experiencing this title. After finally beating it myself, there was quite a lot I had to say about it. A lot of good, and a lot of bad. What were they, you may be wondering? Well, how about we get into this video and find out. So, to start off my first bit of praise, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that is without a doubt the graphics. Final Fantasy VII was a massive game changer for the franchise when it was made, as it was not only the first ever Final Fantasy game to be made in full 3D, but it was also the first ever Final Fantasy game that wasn't going to be appearing on a Nintendo console. For those who don't know, 7 was originally going to be put on the Big N's first 3D console, the legendary Nintendo 64. But due to hardware limitation and cartridge costs, Square made the decision to move development over to the PS1. Discs were a lot cheaper, it just made sense from a business standpoint. And while part of me is kind of curious on how it would have been to have this game in cartridge form, I'm glad Square made the decision as it allowed them to bring as much of their vision to life as possible. And ooh boy, is it one impressive looking vision. While not everything has aged super well in regards to the graphics, it still looks genuinely impressive for the time. And there are two aspects in particular that stand out. First is the pre-rendered backgrounds. These babies are downright gorgeous. While some of the best ones are the Temple of the Ancients and the Forgotten City, my personal favorite has to be the Train Graveyard. It has this hollowness that fits perfectly with what it's going for. Dark, creepy, you can definitely tell that there were a bunch of ghost stories told about this on the playground. Or in Sector 7, whichever one came first. And the second best aspect is without a doubt its phenomenal shot composition. Whoever was in charge of the camera for this game deserves a fucking raise with the beautiful shots they got. Some are incredibly iconic, like the infamous panning up shot from the very start of the game. There are others, though, that I think deserve immense levels of praise. The zoom-in shots when Tifa's helping Cloud work through his broken psyche. The still shot of the staircase in Nibelheim that leaves this feeling of dread as you watch Cloud descend down the stairs. They really took the 3D dimension as seriously as possible to go all out with every single one of the shots in this game, and I am loving it. But out of all of them, I think the best one is when you enter the open world for the first ever time at the end of Disc 1. Now, I'm someone who's been used to the 3D dimension as I grew up in the era where games like that were a lot more common. But even I couldn't help but be absolutely blown away at how expansive this all was. Probably due to playing 6 right before I played 7, I genuinely wonder what it would have been like to be there when this game dropped for the first ever time. It must have been fucking magical to go from this to this. This kind of quality is also seen in battles, as several arenas look really cool and match incredibly well to wherever you are. Speaking of combat, how about we get into the gameplay of 7 now? Like several Final Fantasy games before it, 7 is a turn-based RPG utilizing the action time battle system that became Final Fantasy's bread and butter. But like the other fantasies before it, 7 comes with its own changes to the formula to let it stand out. For one, the amount of party members has been changed from 4 to 3, which admittedly felt like a bit of an odd change, but I found myself really enjoying it. Dropping a party member made the customization aspect of gameplay a bit smoother, considering I had one less member I had to focus on. Also added a little bit more spice to battles, as you now had to pay attention to a party of 3 instead of relying on 4 members. And while that's all well and good, it's honestly kind of overshadowed by the genuine best part of the new gameplay mechanics, the materia system. A gameplay system so incredibly iconic that even if you've never played 7, you've at least heard of the name. But hearing about it and knowing how it works are two completely different things. So how does it work? Well, first you have to get your hands on some materia, which can be found pretty much all over the world, whether it's in materia shops, chests, from minigames, boss fights, or just finding one sitting out on the overworld. They're pretty much everywhere. and come with all sorts of cool abilities. Some will let you cast magic spells like Fire or Cure. Some materia worked like the relics from Final Fantasy VI and grant you job-based abilities, like being able to steal from your foes or covering your allies from damage. Others granted you the ability to summon the gods of old. And some just work like simple stat bots, like materia that would increase your health or magic by a certain percentage. And while all of these are made for a fun and engaging system to play around with, along with the aspect of being able to level them up so you can have better spells and abilities through materia, like, basic example here, having the fire materia on long enough will get you Fire, or Fire 3 as it's called in this one. The materia also has a couple other mechanics imbued into it that I really enjoyed. The first of them being the fact that if you leveled up a materia and took it off a character, the materia retains all the experience you accumulated throughout using it. So if I learned enough to get Fire 3, you could just give it to another character and now they had Fire 3 now, which was really useful considering how many times your party got switched out during the story. The other amazing aspect of the system was all the cool combinations you could do once you put the right materia on. Sure, there were some simple ones like mixing Restore with all to heal the entire party, but then there's the more crazy stuff, like having a level 2 double cut materia and mixing it with counter so you always double slashed enemies for counters. Or going a step further, you can mix its evolved form, otherwise known as the 4 times cut materia, and put on a bunch of mime materia to launch over 20 hits at once. You can mix Ultima with the Quadra materia to launch 4 Ultimas at the same time. You can mix Death Blow and Added Cut to make it so you basically never lose an attack. Mixing the All materia with Master Magic materia to hit every enemy with every type of magic. And would you believe me if I just said this was the tip of the fucking iceberg? There's a lot, and I mean a lot of combinations. And it is great if you are a fan of games that focus on finding out how to turn your enemies into a smear on the ground. And as someone who loves that kind of shit in games, the materia system was without a doubt right up my alley. Of course, the materia system wasn't the only iconic mechanic to come from this game, as 7 also introduced to the series the iconic limit break system. So during battle, there is a gauge that fills up while you're fighting, and once it reaches max, you can unleash a powerful skill in exchange of emptying the entire bar you filled up. And there is a lot of variety throughout these limits thanks to the fact that you would obtain new ones of various levels as you went through the game, which could grant you so many ways to decimate foes. Were you looking for multi-hits, or were you looking for one big hit? Did you want to heal your entire party? Did you want to ruin your entire day by using Kate Sith and killing your party?
Let's go gambling!
All up to you is what I say with this system. You could also do some side missions in the world so you could unlock some secret limits, which was pretty cool, as these things were pretty powerful when you got your hands on them. All in all, the gameplay was pretty dang good. It's got its faults, sure, but I definitely enjoyed my playthrough. And I can easily see why so many people enjoyed the gameplay of 7. But with that, we're finally done talking about gameplay. So let's get into talking about the story and its characters. Honestly, for this part, I'm kind of confused on what to do. Not because I don't have anything to say that was, positive. I really liked my experience. I feel like the story and the characters were very well written. It's not that. It's just, everything I talk about here is probably something you guys already have heard about. 7 is probably one of the most, if not the most well-known RPG story of all time. It was the breakout hit that knocked Final Fantasy into the mainstream and turned it into a household name. It was everywhere at the time. It's a game that, even if you haven't even played it, you pretty much know every big twist because it's been around for as long as it is, and it's been talked about as much as it has. Cloud joining Avalanche, Sephiroth being this looming threat, Aerith's iconic death, the fanbase being this. Everything in this game has been talked about constantly. But even though I knew about like 90% of this game's story, there were still a few moments that genuinely caught me off guard and impressed me. Things like Yuffie not being a mandatory party member, or Zack Fares, despite becoming one of the most integral parts of Final Fantasy VII lore, doesn't even have more than a handful of actual in-game moments, only getting a few cutscenes max. Kinda shows how much Crisis Core ended up fleshing him out as an actual character. Honestly, though, I think my favorite aspect of the story was Cloud himself, being a pretty unreliable narrator in the grand scheme of things. So throughout your Final Fantasy VII journey, Cloud has a ton of moments where he reminisces about his past when he was still a first-class soldier. But there's an interesting tidbit about them, as whenever he reminisces with Tifa in the general vicinity, she starts asking a lot of questions. And at first you just kind of assume that she's just doing this so the game has a reason so you can choose your own story in the flashback. But the more you think about it, one thing starts to stand out. Why is Tifa asking you all these questions? After all, in every flashback, she's pretty much there with Cloud, so it doesn't make sense that she doesn't know what happened. It kind of leaves you scratching your head, wondering what the hell she's even going on about. Why ask me these things if you were there with me? It had me even wondering at one point, oh shit, is there going to be a twist when Tifa's a spy? But then you get to the big reveal and it's like, oh, so that's why she was there. That makes so much more sense. Not only is it just a really good twist that I actually wasn't even expecting, but it also makes sense why Tifa ends up asking those questions, because she remembers everything differently. But the way Cloud speaks with such certainty about the events, she starts doubting herself. It's honestly one of my personal favorite reveals from the series so far, in a genuinely fantastic twist. And while the twists in the story are great, it is obviously elevated due to just how good the characters are. It's easy to see why so many of them have become icons for gaming as a whole. And while I could gush about Cloud or Aerith or Tifa, which you've probably heard time and time again, I'm going to talk about an underrated one, and that's Cait Sith. Well, he is a garbage party member with those fuck-ass limits. I actually really like the story they end up telling with him. Him being a spy for Shinra that slowly grows a spine and later on betrays the company to join up with you to save the world is very simple, but it's genuinely effective in how it's told. I also like how the main antagonist Sephiroth was handled throughout the narrative. I enjoy how, in comparison to someone like Kefka, who is a constant existence in the plot itself, Sephiroth is written more like a looming threat that always feels like he's right behind you. Even when he isn't, everyone just seems to be terrified of even mentioning him at points. And every time he is brought up in the plot, he's doing something insane like blowing up a town or bringing the world to its knees. But there's two moments in particular that I think are the best moments of him. The first is at the start where he just completely slaughters the entire Shinra company, showing you how cruel and merciless he actually is. And the second is the sandworm, where there's this big sand monster that you can't actually fight because it just knocks you out of the battle when you run into it, and it's just way too strong for your team to handle. But when you finally find a way around it, you learn that Sephiroth fought one of these sandworms by himself and just straight up fucking murdered it. They just do a fantastic job setting up Sephiroth as this nigh unstoppable threat that you're genuinely curious how this team is gonna beat. Great, and honestly I'm glad I finally experienced his menacing for myself. With that out there, I've said all I had to say about characters and story, so let's get to my last bit of praise, and that is without a doubt the music. Like the rest of the games, the soundtrack has been praised to hell and back, and I fully agree with every bit of it. Composed by the absolute fucking legend Nobuo Uematsu, a longtime composer for Square, the man once again brought his A-game to the table with some god-level tracks, like the iconic battle theme, and of course the legendary One Winged Angel song. Fantastic tracks through and through that have basically stood the test of time for decades, and that I've always gotten hyped hearing them no matter where they were put. And with that, the pros are finished. So now, let's get to the cons. So now that we have finished going over what was so good about the 7th entry of Final Fantasy, I think it's time we sit back and talk about what I think was bad about it. First and foremost, let's talk about the visuals. So I said earlier that a lot of the game still looks pretty good to this day thanks to its use of pre-rendered backgrounds and its fantastic shot composition. And while I do stand by those takes, one thing I feel that hasn't aged very well were the overworld character models. Many aspects of it were able to remain timeless in terms of its visuals. The overall models of the characters were stuck with this weird block-like design that ends up clashing not only with both the humanistic models and the cutscenes of the gameplay itself. Seeing them go from this block-like design to a fully 3D human model gave me fucking whiplash every time I saw it in the cutscenes, and I was just kind of laughing whenever it happened. It's not the worst thing in the world, far from it, but it is the most jarring aspect about the game that I couldn't help but point out in the visuals. Plus, I think even the devs were able to notice that it looked a little off, considering that 8 and 9 don't have this visual issue and pretty much stay the same looking throughout. So I'm not really going to hold it over the game all that much. Another issue I ended up having was that, thanks to the visuals, some of the areas were kind of confusing to navigate. Because of the way the area is rendered the way it is, parts of the map are pretty unclear on where you have to go next. One example is in Disc 1 at the sector slums, where you meet Aerith for the first ever time, where the slum alley you go to just blends together really weirdly, and you struggle to see where you go next. I spent more time here and in other sections that had this issue, like the train graveyard, more than I would care to admit. Other than that, I actually don't have any other issues with visuals. So let's move on to gameplay. Now, as I stated, 7's gameplay for the most part is very fun. There's a lot of customization options, and it's enjoyable enough to the point where I never got bored while playing it. But I did end up having a couple of issues the longer I partook in it. For one, the summons take way too much time to appear. I get that this game was made to be much more cinematic due to using stronger hardware, but good god, but every single summon slowly making its way to the battlefield starts messing with battle pacing horribly. Thank god the remastered version comes with the option to fast forward, because Jesus, this would have been a slog to sit through without it. Then again, it's pretty easy to ignore the summons in general, just given how goddamn easy this game is overall, due to just how unbelievably broken one of the mechanics are, the limits. By the time you get to the level 2s and 3s of limits in Final Fantasy VII, you basically melt the health of every boss you come across with how overpowered some of these things are. Clouds in particular are fucking health drainers. You can spam them constantly, considering just how easy it is to fill the limit gauge up. Plus, with how the gauge never depletes after battle, you get the hilarious result of jumping into a boss fight, and if you're lucky enough, you can just kill them with 2 limits. I'm not going to fault them by letting you keep filled up limit gauges, because it would just be a pain in the ass to fill them up after every battle. I think I even mentioned that once in my Neo Fantasian review, about how much I didn't like how their tension gauge was handled, due to the fact you basically just lost all of the hard work you put into it. But man, it really does lead to this game being one of the most unbalanced things I played in a while. It's funny, I won't deny, to just kill bosses with 2 or 3 limits, but yeah, this is very much an issue that you can basically ignore 90% of the other gameplay mechanics for the sake of just abusing these. Although, funnily enough, that wasn't the most annoying thing about gameplay. No, that was for the mini-game style sections this game has for some reason. Now in regards to stuff like the Gold Saucer, I'm not speaking about any of the optional ones. The only one you really have to play is the Chocobo Racing, and that's, whatever. No, my annoyance comes from the irritating shit, like the Dolphin minigame where you have to time a button press to what feels like delayed controls, the Soldier Walk minigame that controls like rancid ass dick, the Mountain Climb minigame with button presses to increase body temperature, a Submarine minigame to find a materia. Hell, Tifa gets a fucking slap fight as a button mash minigame. Okay, that one is kind of charming, but it doesn't really change my opinion of this stuff. After a while, I just got sick of it and rolled my eyes whenever a new one popped up. I genuinely feel like you could have cut half of these and the game would have been a lot better for it. And that's all the complaints I really had about gameplay. What about story or characters? Honestly, I didn't have all that many issues with either. The only real complaint I had was that characters like Yuffie and Vincent weren't exactly super interesting. Their stories were fine, but as characters they kind of bored me. Then again, they were the optional characters of the game, so I kind of get why they weren't as interesting as the main cast. Probably used all the writing to focus on the main ones instead. Which, to her credit, works very well. The main cast of 7 is great. Also, this doesn't mean they're bad characters. I just don't think they're as interesting or well written as the main cast. And with that said, those are all of my cons. So let's move on to my final thoughts. So, we finally made it to the end. And after this little dive into one of gaming's most iconic titles, I gotta say, while there were aspects of 7 that haven't exactly aged well, I still think it's a pretty damn good game overall, and I can definitely see why it became such a staple of RPG history. And that is why I think my final rating is a very strong 8 out of 10. And with that, we have reached the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching. It's been pretty nice getting back to Final Fantasy stuff, especially since I spent so long not reviewing anything from it. I've already got the 8 review at the ready, so in a couple of weeks I'll probably start working on that. So stay tuned for that. And if you want to follow along with this journey, make sure to like and sub down below. We're on the way to 1K and I think we can do it this year. Leave a comment down below to help me in the algorithm or chat it up. Ring the bell for a little notification action. And I'll see you next time for more RPG content.